So you guys are wondering what in the world 3D, CGI, all this stuff can do for you. Well, I want you guys to see just a rough example of the power that 3D really has to offer. And it doesn't really matter whether you're a portrait photographer, a cosplay photographer like I am, fine art, products, all of it all of it is relevant when it comes to the world of 3D and CGI. And so I'm super excited to be able to dive in and start to teach you the base fundamentals. Now, whether you're actually wanting to be the one who is applying the knowledge from this and doing the 3D or CGI artwork yourself, or being able to direct somebody that's doing it for you, knowing all of these fundamentals is only going to help your creative freedom that you have and your ability to move your projects forward. So go ahead, enjoy this video that I put together, kind of explaining some of the stuff and walking through a little bit, even just a speed edit of the way that this stuff is going to work and the knowledge that you're going to gain from this tutorial. I'm super excited. Check it out. For those of you who are taking the class, I'm super excited to be able to dive into all of this stuff here with Cinema 4D and Octane and really start to bring a lot of stuff to light that you may have been in the darkness with. And this is really going to up your game in whatever type of photography you're doing. So let's go ahead and dive in. I'll see you guys in software. Now, before I take any of my portraits into 3D to start building the background, there's a couple different things that I do here in Photoshop first. So let's go ahead and talk about this. We have a portrait image from David Parrish, and I really liked a lot about this image, and that's primarily the model and the pose, but also the lighting. It kind of fits a lot of the dramatic style that I like to use when I'm shooting. So fit perfectly for this Hollywood inspired room, and this is what we're going to use. So here I just did a basic retouch on the model, and I've also created a cutout and then adjusted from a portrait to a landscape orientation for this image. So we can go ahead here and turn off the background, and you can see how I've cut the model out and I've got her ready now to be placed in an overlay into that Hollywood inspired room. Now I've also gone ahead and created just a rough horizon line here on the bottom, so I could use that to just aid in matching everything up once I get to 3D. So at the end of all of this, this is where I start my process for 3D compositing. And in this case, now I just go ahead and export a 24 or a PNG 24 with transparency. And let's go ahead and move into Cinema now. All right, so here we are inside the Hollywood inspired room from our tutorial, and we're going to use this to place David's image and really just recreate a new background. So what we're going to do for this here first is go ahead and create a foreground object. So we can head up to where this floor icon is here in the top panel and just head down to foreground. Now with the foreground being placed in, we can see that it's just showing gray here from the camera view. So we'll need to create a material to be placed on that foreground. Now I've already set this up and I can show you exactly what I've done here. Actually, let's go ahead and we'll just create a brand new material. So the easiest way to go about this is to simply double click in our material manager here, and that's going to create a new Cinema 4D material. Now, the Cinema 4D materials actually work best for the foreground object. I've tried them in Octane and haven't quite gotten the same results. So we'll go ahead and double click on this material icon. And that's going to bring up our material editor. Now we can turn off reflectance here, and what we're looking for is just the color and the alpha channels here. So in the color, what we can do is go ahead and grab the image of our model, and we can just go ahead and drag that PNG image here into the texture. Go ahead and click no, we don't want to save this. Now at this point, we can head down to the alpha channel, and since our PNG is transparent, we'll go ahead and just drag that into our texture for this as well. And then we don't want to save this to our project. So we'll go ahead and close that. Now at this point, we can go ahead and close the material editor, and we can drag this material. We can go ahead and just name this model so that I stay organized on this side, and go ahead and drag that onto the foreground object. And now what we'll see is our model is going to be placed in the viewport here. And it's kind of a rough method right now. It's a little bit more low resolution. And generally speaking, what I'm looking for is something like this, not necessarily a perfectly crystal clear image, because I don't want to go and muddy up the responsiveness of the viewport by showing any more than what we need to. But this will show just fine at render time, and it's not something that I even worry about on this side of it, because I oftentimes just do my compositing in Photoshop rather than trying to render this image out here. Now, this is one of the fun things about 3D. So at this point, we've got the chair here, which is the classic chair from our tutorial. And I've also grabbed one of the PRO EDU 3D objects, which is the Mole Richardson rolling spotlight here, that we can use to maybe adjust a little bit of the composition that we have going on. So what we'll do is go ahead and grab this chair, and we can bring this in and really just make it look like she would be sitting on that chair. Now, we can spend plenty of time on this and make sure our image is being scaled up or scaled down, and the models and everything else work perfectly. But at the end of the day, we're just looking for a good image. So what we can do is start to fake a little bit of this. Now, originally, this was shot at an 80mm lens, or an 80mm focal length. And once I changed the composition of this, I really wanted to use something a little bit less. And so I went to a 40mm for this example here. And the nice part about this is we can go ahead and start to move any of these objects into place. And if we don't like the scale that we have here, say on the orientation of this chair or the scale of the chair, we can go ahead and just scale that down quite a ways, and really just move this into a position that would work well for what we're doing here. So at this point, I'm just going to switch into my bottom perspective viewport. That's going to allow me to move around the scene a little bit more fluid. And now I'm just going to move everything around, primarily this chair here at the moment, until we have something that looks fairly decent, like she would actually be sitting right on the edge of this chair. We can scale that down just a little bit more. And I think that'll work fine for what we're doing here at the moment. Now we can go ahead and grab this spotlight. And I know that they're quite large in person, so I'm not too worried about scale with these at the moment. But we can go ahead and scale this down slightly. Can rotate this into place some, and maybe just leave this here off on the edge so that maybe with adjusting the light, it makes a little bit of sense here with the way that the model is sitting. Now, as far as the actual camera placement goes, what we'll do is we can duplicate this camera here a moment, and I will copy my protection tag up. And now we can really go ahead here and move this background entirely to fit the exact composition that we want. So if we do want, say, the light coming from the window to really make sense, and maybe a sunset type of lighting here on her right side or camera right, we could do that here through the windows. We could adjust this a little bit the other way here so that we're capturing the door behind her, but it's not going to be a major part of the rest of the scene. Whereas in the other camera angle here, the door is directly behind her shoulder, which I don't think is too bad. So what we'll do here is just go ahead and start the render at this point, and then we can adjust our materials from here. So let's go ahead and pop into a new layout here, and we'll use the layout here that has my render view right next to my other viewports here that I have in the scene. Now this is very similar to what you guys have to use from the tutorial, so I think it'll work just fine for this case. Now what we'll do is go ahead and take a look at the render settings here a moment. So what I've done, and I know we didn't talk about the image size in Photoshop, but what I have done is adjusted the image size here just a little bit in Cinema, and that's primarily just because we don't need a 10K image from the adjustment to the composition that I made in Photoshop. Now in the Octane settings here, before we send our scene to render, I am essentially using just the same preset that we created in the tutorial that's going to help us get a nice result fairly quickly. So with that being said, let's go ahead. I'm just going to save the scene a moment and we can click render. All right, so we're back in Photoshop and we've got a bunch of different render layers here, and definitely looks pretty sweet. So this is one of my favorite parts about compositing on the 3D side, is that there's so much information that you can export that is going to work for you rather than against you. So when you're working in photography, you know, what you shoot is what you get, and you can always manipulate that, obviously working in RAW and what have you. But there's a lot of benefits from working with 3D backgrounds and things like these masking layers that you can use to go through and create selections easily. You can have depth masks that are going to work amazing for adding atmosphere. They work really well with bits of color grading and so on. So what we're going to do is go ahead and start to work with putting the model here into our render. And so what we'll do in this case is actually put her directly into this scene file or into this Photoshop document rather than putting this background into the original Photoshop document. So what we'll do here is go ahead and turn these all on. And I can select all of my layers. There we go. And at this point, we'll just go ahead and create adjustment layers, or sorry, create smart objects for all of these here. And so we'll go ahead and use a handy dandy action that I have here that will do that. I would somewhere include that, but I cannot remember for the life of me where this is at on the web. And so I'll look for that, you know, maybe you guys will see it in the future. But essentially what we're doing is creating smart objects of all of our different layers here so that we can go ahead and make camera raw adjustments to those, or adjustments in general that we think are going to work for the final composite. Now, post-production is a huge part of the 3D process. Just as it is with photography, it's just a little bit different and working with things in a bit different of a way, but the idea of post-production and working with your different files is still the same. Post looks good on everything, just a matter of how you apply it. All right, so now all of these smart objects are created. And so what we're going to do here at this point is simply go in and hide a couple of these elements that we don't need. We can hide our guides real quick. And then I'm going to convert this image to sRGB from its current color profile. So we'll go to convert to profile, and it's Adobe RGB currently. We'll change it to sRGB. Go ahead and click OK. And do we want to rasterize? No, we won't rasterize. So we'll give Photoshop a moment to think here. And then what we'll do is select all of these. We can right click, and then we'll go to convert to smart object from here. And what I didn't do is actually throw the background in. So we'll duplicate this for a moment. Right click and then convert to smart object. So I like to work this way when I'm doing it because then I can just open this file back up and hide that smart object. So Controller Command C, head over into our render passes here. We can select all of these passes, Controller Command G to group them, and we'll just name this 3D comp. And then Control Shift V or Command Shift V, and that's going to place our model in here. Now there is a bit of a difference because I did scale down the initial comp or the PNG file that we brought into Cinema. And so now we have a little bit different of a scale here with this current piece. So what we'll do here is we can head up to View and then New Guide Layout. We can change this to 2. There we go. And now what that's going to do is just give us guides so we can scale this image right down into the composite the way that we need. And so we'll just zoom in here and make sure that it fits. We can go ahead and check both sides. There we go. All right, go ahead and click enter and we'll confirm that transform. Now with those adjustments committed, we can go ahead and just open up our subject's smart object here for a moment and hide that background again. We'll go ahead and save it. And then once that updates, we can go back in and actually start the background composite. So let's go ahead and do that now. All right, so now we have our model inside of the 3D space that we had just created. And so what we'll do here is we can change her smart object to model. And then we can go ahead and start to take a look at the 3D composite down here on the bottom. So we have a whole lot of layer masks, or sorry, a whole lot of layers. And what we're going to do is start to group these in a way that sort of makes sense. So all of our passes, I call them accessory passes. They're really just masking passes, things that I use specifically for masking. We're going to bring all of these up top. That'll include the shading normal. The shadow pass and ambient occlusion can stay out. So we'll take the 3 of these layers here, Controller Command G, and we can just name these, and we'll just say ACC or accessory passes. So these are just nice passes for me to have, and I'm sure we'll get into this. This is just going to be a quick composite, nothing too in depth, but I just want to show you guys kind of the process that I would use to get this stuff rolling. So there are a couple different types of passes here once these accessory passes are hidden. We have our shadow pass, ambient occlusion, a bunch of different light passes, and a couple denoised passes as well. So the denoised passes here, if we go ahead and maybe what we'll do is we can hide everything there and we can grab the reflection direct. So this is the regular reflection direct pass. You can see bits of noise and grain that are there. Now, if we go to the denoised version, that's going to just help remove a bunch of the grain. Now, there are pros and cons to both types of passes. It's really just a preference thing on what you might use. So don't feel like you have to use anything specific. In this case, we're just working in an sRGB workflow here. We're not really doing anything that's super in depth, like maybe 32-bit color space or linear space workflows here. So let's go ahead here and we can start to remove some of these. And one of the biggest things to remember when you're talking about these lighting passes is that the ones that are adding light are going to be placed on a screen blend mode, or sometimes an add or a linear dodge or add blend mode. But I usually work in screen when I'm in sRGB. Now, the shadow passes here are going to be multiply. So these are the 2 primary ways to use it. Shadow passes, anything like the shadow, ambient, occlusion, these are always going to be placed on a multiply blend mode. And then your reflection, your different lighting passes are all going to use screen. So I usually like to use my shadow passes below my reflection passes, and that's just so that the reflection isn't getting cut by a shadow pass. Now, another good thing to look at here is that you have your beauty pass. And bring these up here. You have two different types of beauty. You have your standard beauty pass, which isn't going to be denoised. And if we zoom quite a ways in here, we can see that we have what we call fireflies, or just little artifacts where the lighting samples were starting to maybe get a bit confused here in the specular or reflective areas. Now we also have the denoised, and the denoised beauty is going to help get rid of that. It doesn't always work 100% perfect, but it's going to help. And so what we'll do here is go ahead and take our denoise beauty pass, and we're just going to bring this down to the bottom. Going to hide all of our other layers here. Now we're just going to group some of these layers that I put here in case we need them, but might not necessarily have to have them in. And that primarily has to do with the diffuse layers here and some of these other lighting passes. So we can bring these up. I know that we may want the shadow pass, so we'll bring that down. Reflection pass, we'll keep that. So reflection, and then the reflection direct, and we also have our reflection indirect. It just has to do with the direct reflections from the lighting and the indirect, or say bounce reflections, things of that nature. So we can go ahead and grab these two passes and bring those up with our diffuse passes. And we'll just start a new group. So Control or Command G, we'll start that new group, and we'll just call this odd passes. Just in case we don't have to use them, we can always delete these later to save file size as we start to get working here. Now, we can take a look at our light passes. So for example, what we'll do is we'll start with this denoise beauty. So looking at the black points here in our image, we can go ahead and look, say, right into the iris of our model and look at the shadows. So we can either look directly into the pupil, or we can look into the iris here, and then look at some of the darker values that are happening in the background. So what I generally like to do here is actually go in and somewhat match those up. So what we'll do is go ahead and use camera raw. It looks like we need to crunch our black point down just a little bit. So Control or Command Shift and A on this smart object is going to bring up our camera raw. And now we have the camera raw workspace open. So believe it or not, a lot of times I might actually simply work right inside of this workspace and not really allow myself to get too in depth with anything else. Now, when we're in this space, we have a couple different options. And so what we'll do is zoom back out a little bit here. We can frame our piece. And I really don't like to go in right away and adjust clarity. Clarity for me is something that I like to do locally 90% of the time. Now, if I'm working on renders that are just raw renders, and say maybe for IG or social content, I might go in and boost this clarity up just to give it a nice little pop of detail. But usually I like to work with this a little bit more in a detail oriented fashion where it's local adjustments. But what we can do is go in and take our black point, and we can move that down just a ways. And that's going to deepen the blacks in the image. And I'm going to take this shadow slider and maybe boost that up just a little bit to help out with some of the ambient light. So if we go ahead and press P on our keyboard, we can see the adjustments here where we're deepening some of the blacks here still. We can maybe even bring this down just a little bit to maybe 25. But we're still getting some nice variation now in between the lights and the shadows. So we can go ahead and click OK. and let that get applied. Now that's bringing a little bit of saturation in, and it's starting to help really make these black points between the background here and our model just a little bit more cohesive, more specifically in the deeper shadows here, or black areas that you would see right in where her hands meeting her chin. And we still have some bounce there, but more like in her pupils and where that's going to sit. So we can start in this space here. And now we can start to take a look at a few of the other areas here that are going on in the scene. So looking at my ambient occlusion pass, we know that ambient occlusion is essentially just adding a soft shading or a soft shadowing in between objects. And it's a bit more proximity based. The closer one object is or one crevice is to another, you're going to get shadowing there, which is why on the floor here, we're getting some really nice breakup in between the displacement that's happening there. Now we can go ahead and take this, set this to a multiply blend mode, and we'll immediately see what starts to happen here. And I really don't mind this look as it sits because it's darkening things down just a little bit more. And we're getting some nice shadowing, maybe a little bit more on the background to help certain areas out. So we can leave that for now. We have our shadow pass here that we can go ahead and set to multiply as well. And now we can see how this is starting to work. And it's going to start pushing a bit more of those shadows here that are happening in the scene. Now the reflection, if we go ahead and turn this on, clicking too many times, go ahead and turn reflection on, set that to screen. There we go. With that set, now if we turn this off and on, you can see that we're getting quite a bit more reflection now. And so this is a really easy way to go through and to start adding these little details into your scene and really not get too carried away with everything else that's happening. So our beauty pass here, since we're using the denoise beauty, we can go ahead and bring this into the odd passes just to organize a little bit better. And the reflection pass, I feel like, really doesn't need to affect anything but maybe the floor. And so what we can do is start to use some layer masks to break up where these adjustments are actually happening in our scene. So for example, I think what I want to do is take this ambient occlusion, and I really just want this primarily to affect the floor. So what we'll do is head up into our accessory passes, material ID, W for the wand tool, and we can select our floor here. Go ahead and I'll change my threshold to 15. And then what we can do is head back down to the ambient occlusion, create a layer mask based off of that selection. And now our ambient occlusion is only affecting our ground, which is what we want there. Now, looking at, say, the reflection pass, I feel like we don't need this reflection pass everywhere. And so what I may do with this more specifically is just target the background here. And so we can do that quite easily. And we'll grab our wand tool, turn contiguous off, and see if we can get this selection here. There we go. And now we can select a few of these different elements here that are in the background. And they're just going to add to that selection as we start to move forward. Now, at this point, I'm really not concerned that you have these slight breaks. If we need to fix that, we can. But we'll head down to the reflection layer, create a layer mask based off of that. And now we can see that we have those adjustments specifically targeting that background area. Now, from here, as we start to move up, we have various levels of this reflection that we can use in certain areas. And I don't know that we specifically need any of these right now. And so what we'll do is we can take our reflection direct, we'll pull that up to our odd passes folder and go ahead and create a red label for that there. Maybe I can do this without it sticking on me. There we go. All right, so let's reorganize a little bit, bring that shadow pass back down, reflection, reflection indirect. And so what I want to do is actually make this reflection layer just target the ground. And so we can Alt or Option, Control or Command, press those there, and we can copy this layer mask from the ambient occlusion up to our reflection layer here. And so with that, we can go ahead and set that to screen. Make sure that in our odd passes, we don't have anything else turned on. And now we have a fairly decent break on the floor right in front of our model here. And so in looking at this, I think what we can do is press G for the gradient tool. If it's going to let us work with that here. There we go. And we'll just draw a black gradient on that layer mask. We can Alt or Option, click the layer mask so I can show you a little bit better. And we'll just draw a gradient there so that as this reflection gets closer to camera, it starts to dull down a bit. And so now if we turn this off and on, we can see that we have a little bit more depth to the back floor here and not too much of a harsh brightness here as we start to get closer. So our light pass 3 is our key light. So if we want to use that more to add to the scene, we can go ahead and set that to screen. Now, the good part about this is that they are smart objects. So Control or Command M for the curves tool. And we'll go ahead and we can really start to crank some of these values and start to make that chair just a little bit more cohesive. Go ahead and click OK there. And so now we're getting quite a bit more light there from that key light specifically. Post-processing. I do know we'll want to use this, and so what I'll do for this one is bring this all the way up above our model. And then we can go ahead and set that to screen, blend mode. See how that's working. So the biggest thing that I'm seeing right now with this is that I'm not sure if I like the color cast. I feel like it's not quite orange enough. And so what we'll do here is Control or Command U, and we can bring up the hue saturation, and this is going to allow us to adjust the color of our light here. And so we'll find something a little bit closer to match what's actually hitting our model here from this side. And now, as I'm starting to look through it, I'm sure you guys can see it here already. We're getting into these areas here on the model where we're starting to get the bloom layer that's passing through that. So I think we can go ahead and maybe just put this right in the bottom here, right underneath our model. And I think that looks fine. Yeah, that'll work. Sometimes you can get into an awkward spot where you want, say, the bloom that's coming from this light to really hit your model and maybe go just a bit over like a lens flare or anything like that would. But it doesn't look like we have to worry about that too much at the moment. Alrighty, so light pass 4 is going to be our light pass here from the bottom. And this is going to be all from this spotlight. So we can go ahead and take that and set that to screen and see what that looks like. And it looks like it's adding a bit of nicer detail here, specifically to the chair. Now, what we will want to do is maybe go in and grab this hue saturation, Alt or Option, Control or Command, and we can drag this smart filter down to light pass 4. And now we can see that that color is starting to change, and that's going to be a little bit more realistic to what's happening here on our model. Now, so far, I'm liking where this is at. I feel like everything's working fairly decent. One of the things that I do like to get into is zooming in a ways. Now, in this example, as it sits, we do have a little bit of the 3D geometry showing some faceting here on the edges where it's not completely smooth. We're not too concerned with that right now. But what I do see is that we have areas like this here that wouldn't really be getting hit from the key light here, and that's primarily because our model is sitting right in front of it. So this is where some of these other passes that we have can come into play. Now, the diffuse passes, if we know or remember what diffuse is, it's essentially just color. So we're dealing with the color and lighting information. Now, if we go down to the diffuse indirect, we're going to get a little bit darker of a result just from the indirect light. So I think this might actually be a good one to use. Let's check it out again here. Actually, let's use the diffuse pass first. So what we'll do for this diffuse pass, close our odd passes group. We can drag that right below our accessory passes. Yellow, there we go. Now I can see what's happening. Open both of these groups, and we're just going to select the chair. So with our chair selected now, we can create a layer mask on the diffuse pass. And now we can see that all we are going to have to do in this case is just remove that reflection from the areas we don't want. Or sorry, remove the diffuse pass. So this is simple layer masking techniques. We all know that when you're painting white, you're going to show what's there on that layer mask, and black is going to remove it. So we can go ahead with a black brush per se. There we go. And now we can just start to remove those details and bring back that reflection in areas that we want it, while keeping that removed from the areas we don't. So you might get a little bit up there in the corner. Not too big of a problem. There we go. And that's fine. Now, looking at the rest of this here, I think one of the things that we can do is start to introduce some of the shadowing here that would be happening on the floor. So if we look at our original image here and the way that these shadows worked on the floor, as well as the reflections, I think we can get a pretty decent base of how this really should look. Now, our floor, I don't think from where we're at is going to be quite as glossy or quite as showing in the way that those reflections are going to work. But I like the way that this fits here, because this would sort of make sense with the brighter colors here in her dress and the way that they're reflecting there. So I'm not so worried about that. The shadow isn't too pronounced. So what I'll do is go ahead here and we'll say, let's see if that's really adjusting. Okay, so that's not doing too much. So right underneath our model layer, we can go ahead and create a black solid. So solid color, go ahead and click OK there. We can hide that for a moment. Go in and we can color pick one of our shadows here. Turn that back on, and then invert the layer mask. And now what I'll do here is just use a soft round brush, pen pressure sensitivity, and our flow is at 15. And I'm just going to work and build up some of the shadows that are going to be happening here underneath her dress. So the biggest part of this is keeping it somewhat realistic. So if there's going to be or would make sense to have a breakup in the shadow, you put a breakup in a shadow there. You don't just want to say do a drop shadow on this and have that just kind of cascade over the whole thing. So we'll start to work with this. These are fairly close to the floor, so a harder shadow will do just fine. The cool part about doing it this way is that we can always go through and adjust the way that this layer mask is working, because it's all strictly off of a layer mask and we're not really painting in these more fine details in more of a destructive manner, I guess, by just doing it with a new layer or with a standard layer. Makes it a little bit harder to work with that way. So continuing on with the shadow, let's see on the back side here, add a little bit. Now we would have a little bit of light or a little bit of shadow coming from that spotlight as well. So what we can do is just start to introduce just a little bit of that, what might be a shadow coming from that side, and then getting overpowered by the light that's happening here. It's really important to know the way that this is all going to work and the way that lighting is going to work. It's not always 100% perfect unless you're taking the time to make it 100% perfect. Some cases you need to, some you don't. I've really like to think that I spend a lot of time trying to figure out whether I actually need to have 100% accurate details or if I can get away with doing just enough to pass. And in most cases, you can do just enough to pass and it's not really going to hurt your process at all, and your clients are still going to be happy with it. Now, looking at the back wall here, I'm wondering if there's a way that I can separate just a little bit more my model here specifically from that background. And before we get to that, I do want to paint a little bit more of a shadow here. And we can paint that right into this chair, just to make sure that we have a nice little breakup here of shadow that's happening on that side. We can also go in and make some adjustments if we need to. Let me name this here so I can remember what that is. It's always important to rename your layers. Keep your files organized, or as organized as possible. Sometimes it makes sense to do right away. Other times it makes sense to do that as you need it. I really think this is working fairly well, so I'm not really going to adjust the way that chair, maybe I will. Let's just do it. We can go ahead here and tone that reflection layer down. Now, these little areas here, like on the chair where you can see for sure that that's a hard faceted edge, we'll just go through and we can clone stamp that later on and just kind of get rid of those little jaggy edge details. It's not really too much of an eyesore here at the moment, but it's definitely something that if I were doing this on a client project, I would go in and fix. Now, let's go ahead and see if we can add a little bit of light to the background here. And so what I want to do is simply go in and make a couple selections here. Holy cow. Let me grab my mouse for this. So we'll select our green and a few of these various colors here that are right in between. And we can paint these out here with the layer mask as soon as we're done. So that's not too big of a deal. And we'll keep that selection. We can go ahead and hide our material ID layer there. And what we'll do is maybe create, we'll say a gradient. Why not? I don't use gradients enough. So we can go ahead and create just a simple white gradient, or maybe a slight off-white. You can do something more on the blue side here to kind of work well with the color from these lights and whatnot. And we'll change this to a radial gradient type. We can throw this here behind our model. And what we'll do is we'll throw it down just a ways here so that it might seem to make sense with the way that the light direction is going. It doesn't have to be perfect. I just want it to be there enough that we can get a slight break up. And then we'll set this to maybe soft light seems to work okay. And so we just have a little bit of a break up there so we can see some more of the silhouette on our model. It's not something that really destroys the entire way that this wall is working. Now, at this point, I think what we're going to do is adjust this layer mask. So we can see here where all of the areas are that didn't get selected properly. This is something we deal with quite often as 3D artists, and it doesn't always have to be a pain. In most cases, I'll just head in and fill this with white, and then you can do the same. So this is just the marquee selection tool, and it just makes it quite easy to go through and get your selections back to where you want them to be. And we'll talk about this stuff a lot more in depth here, I'm sure, as we start to pursue more CGI here at PRO EDU. There's a lot of cool tips and tricks and things on the more advanced side that we could start discussing. And I'm quite excited to get to that with you guys because I think that this will be pretty cool overall. So there we go. All right. We have a selection. All right. So now let's go ahead and turn this off and on. And we can see now that it's covering most of that there. Now we can stack this as we would normally and put this down maybe below our shadow and ambient occlusion layers so that we're still getting the breakup of these wall elements there. And because it's not rasterized, we still can go in and we can adjust the way that the flow of this is going to work. And so if I really maybe wanted to bring this up and work a little bit more directly behind her, we can do that. We can enter the layer mask and we'll say, go ahead and get rid of the door here and the rest of everything on this side. And now we won't be affecting anything past this point, just in case it were to happen to spill out. So at this point, I'm quite happy with the overall base of this and where that's sitting. Now, I could go in and do some frequency separation and clean up quite a bit more on her. I think what we'll do here, just for the sake of the tutorial, is, or the sake of this example, is just do a very quick, maybe more macro dodge and burn, and nothing on the micro side. I think that'll work out well. So we can go in here and we can just add a dodge and a burn. So I'm using Retouching Toolkit for this. It's one of my favorite panel sets that just allows me to organize all my actions or workflow stuff. And so what we'll do is we can just go in and make sure that we have, okay, our flow is decently low. It doesn't need to be perfect. And we'll just go in and add a little bit of light. Make sure we have everything deselected there. Put these layers, I wondered why that was off. There we go, cancel out of that. Put the dodge and burn up above our model here. There we go. So now we can just go in and paint a little bit more light onto our model here. And it doesn't have to be anything extravagant at the moment. This is just making some of these highlights pop a little bit better. And then we'll burn the shadows slightly. I dodge and burn my 3D renders all the time, just as I would any other product. I think that there's a lot to be said about taking a few minutes to do some post work on your 3D renders. Helps them look a lot better, more realistic, and you can get a lot more detail out of them once you take them into Photoshop, just as we would once we start to work on our photography. Start to work on our photographs. So go ahead here, just accentuate just a few of these creases, make everything pop just a little bit. All right, so we can take a look here. Now, what I do think is that our chair is just about as much of a subject as our model is. And I say that because we still want to focus on making sure that some of the detail that's carried over from the chair or from her is being brought into the chair as well. So if we're doing a little bit of dodge and burn on her, we can go ahead and dodge and burn this chair just a little bit, just to make sure that everything's matching up decently there. Now, let's go ahead and zoom in and look at something here. And this is one point that I want to bring up because I think that it's important. Because we talk about doing post-production and destroying renders all the time. And I think this is a good point to which we can discuss this. Now, when you're working on 3D elements or 3D renders, composites, what have you, it's really important to go in and take a look at the details and figure out exactly what's here and get into the finer details. So, for example, we can see that there is grain on our model, especially with being, obviously shot as far back as this was. You're going to have imperfections and bits of grain and things of that nature that are happening in the background. And so it's really important to add that stuff into your 3D renders, especially when you're doing composites. Now, this is a little bit faster. This is something that, is just quick and much more for example's sake, but the concepts are still the same. And so I think what we can do here is go in and add just a little bit of grain to this background. And I'm going to do this in probably the dirtiest way that we could do when adding grain. So let's go ahead and we'll create a new solid color. And we'll go ahead and make this, we'll just say a 50% gray. There we go. Click OK. Filter. And then we can go ahead, and actually we need to, I'm going to convert this to a smart object just in case we want to adjust this. Because we either have to rasterize that or create a smart object from it. So I'd rather have the capabilities of going back if we really wanted to and adjusting the way that this is going to work. So at this point here, let's go ahead and we can add noise. So we'll just go to add noise here. Now, what we're looking for in this case is just to somewhat match the noise that's happening here, maybe right in her neck area, underneath her hand. I think those are good areas to sort of look for. And so I think we can do maybe a 3.5, and that should be all right. Now, once that's applied, we can go ahead and just set this to overlay. And we can see that that's going to give us a nice bit of grain overall. Now, grain generally should show a bit more in the shadows than it does the highlights and whatnot. For this example, we're not going to correct that. And what we'll actually do in the end of all of this is really go in and add grain to the overall image if need be, but I don't think we really need to right now. So here we sit. We got our 3D composite from our beauty render all the way to our beautiful model here sitting in our rendered space. And now at this point, we can really start to work with color grading and getting more out of this final image. Now, I feel like it's pretty fine the way that it is. I feel like I'd be happy with this if I needed to just move on to the next project. But what we can do is really start to add a little bit more to this. So let's go ahead and do that. And we will start off maybe with we can start off with a gradient. I use gradients often enough. And I think what we can do here is, I really want to try something. Let's try something. What would happen if we start to introduce color to this back wall? So let's do that. This is how I work, guys. Just so you know, I'm all over the place if I don't have to be perfectly on it. So here we go. We're just going to make selections of this entire background. In fact, we can do everything all the way over just in case we want to have these details there. There we go. And what we'll do in this case is just add a new gradient. Then I just want to set that to maybe a overlay. Just start to tone it back a bit. I don't know if that'll work very well. We'll see. Maybe we'll leave it. No, it doesn't work. Okay, see, I lied. All right, let's do this. Okay, so where were we? Gradients. Go ahead and create a gradient here. We're just going to make a probably dark or brown / black gradient. We can select the color there that's in our hair. And go ahead here and click OK. We can move this gradient over from the side this way. Maybe scale this up just a ways. So what I'm looking for is really just something more to start to subdue the details that we have here on the far side of this image. And this makes it pretty easy just to throw a gradient in there, and it starts to really pull focus here towards the model. Now, I would generally do this whole process in Lightroom. So I really like to work in Lightroom with all of the stuff that I have here. In fact, we can possibly even hide that. And then what I'll do is head all the way up to the top, Control Alt Shift and E, or Command Option Shift and E. It's going to create a new layer. We're just going to name this grade. And then what we can do here is right click, convert to smart object, and then we'll just do the final post adjustments in Camera Raw just because we can. So now with this selected, it's a smart object. Control Shift A or Command Shift A. It's going to enter the Camera Raw workspace. And now from here, we can really just sort of do things the way that I would do them. I'm still getting used to the new Camera Raw workspace here in Photoshop rather than Lightroom. But nonetheless, let's go ahead and get to it. We are going to grab the graduated filter tool. We can pull up here from the bottom. And then actually we can rotate that over just a way and drop our exposure just a little bit. Then we'll create a new one here. It's going to drop our exposure from this side, and let's see if this works. See, now I like this a little bit more than just doing our standard black gradient that we were doing prior. And that's because we're still able to capture some of the details there on that back side. Now we can go here in this one and boost those shadows. So there still are some shadows there a little bit. And I'm not too worried about that. Okay, maybe one from the top here. Let's start to bring that in right before it starts to get into her hair there. And now at this point, let's go ahead and let's see, we can go ahead back into edit, take a look at the clarity and see what the clarity of the image is going to do as a whole. So I really don't mind it overall. So this is what I was saying. I like to go in and add certain bits of detail in certain places as I'm working. So if we head into the brush tool and go ahead and reset these settings here, grab our clarity and bring that up a ways. We can use our bracket keys to adjust the size of our brush. And then we can just paint a little bit of detail here. Now, when I'm doing this stuff, more specifically, I like to stay as far away from the model's skin as possible. And this is more something I do specifically in cosplay work, where I'll go in and I'll make certain things pop. And clarity just really helps enhance those mid-tone details and adds contrast to those midtones. And so it works out pretty well. And so we'll go through here and maybe add some clarity here to this chair. Puts a little bit more detail there in perspective. And then we can go ahead and maybe create a new brushing set. Now I'm just going to paint some detail here on the hair. Now this is something, maybe if I'm doing this a little bit more just for Instagram specific, this isn't really a client project that I'm needing to deliver. I just need it to look good. It needs to look as best as it can in a fast manner. So we'll go ahead here and just start to pop in some of these details from the light if we can. It feels like those are all coming together quite nicely there. And now what I'll do is just on her eyes here, not actually getting into her eyes. And this isn't going to be insane on the detail side for retouching. Don't kill me. Now, the stuff that I'm looking at is really more just the overall details. And this is how I like to create speed art. I don't always like to get so intricate and worried about every single pore, every single detail all the time. As long as that final image looks good, it's often good enough for what I'm going to need to be doing. Now, once we run into certain issues like this here, now we can see, and this was something, sometimes I fix it, sometimes people just don't catch that it's not perfect. This is one of those things for me that when you have these masks that get a bit grainy, it's really easy to fix from a visual standpoint. And in this case, I'm just going to bring my sharpness all the way down and slightly destroy these edges here. Now that's going to kill the detail there. I know how it works. But at the same time, it's just going to visually remove the way that those lines are working and that breakup in that line. So you're just disintegrating some of the detail that's there and making it such a harsh eyesore, while being able to obviously go back in and start to adjust some of these details again and really pull it a little bit closer together. So we're going to pretend that's okay. Go ahead and actually, I think we can head back into the basic panel. Okay, there we go. Now at this point, we can start to talk about grading and really figuring out what we want to do. So generally, I like to bring my vibrance down. And so we can remove that just slightly. And then maybe we can get into actual color grading. It's a little bit difficult because sometimes I like to do this, sometimes I don't. It really just depends on the overall mood of the image that I'm wanting to work in. And, in this case here, we're able to go through and really start to pull a lot of the colors out of this image and start to fit into a space that I think would work really well. Now, it is a bit more difficult because we have multiple different colors that are going on here in the scene. So looking at our original, going to more of our final, it's one of those things for me that as long as I have a reason to put the color where I'm putting it, I think I'm fine. And that's really how I approach a lot of my art, is when I'm looking at these specific colors that are going on, as long as it makes sense. I don't always feel the need to get super technical in color theory and that whole game. It's one of those things for me that, as long as I hit the emotion, especially this is just stuff here that's more along this line of more fun art, fantasy art, things that don't always have to be so realistic. We spend a whole lot of time worrying about details that other people might not notice. All right, so having a super rough time at the moment with my tablet. So let's go ahead and use the mouse here to start to push this just a little bit. There we go. I think we're just going to work with a very basic grade to it. We can maybe do something a little bit in the highlights, but I don't know if it's really needed. And check the before and after. I think that'll be fine. I can go back and add in just a little bit of my vibrance here. Back up at the basic and add a little bit more of that vibrance pop to it. Now we can go ahead and, where are my effects? There we go. We can go ahead and take a look at just overall, say like a film grain on the whole thing. Now this is something, there's, like I said before, there's times where I'll do this in Photoshop, and there's times like this where I'm just going to do it over the entire image and not worry too much about it. So I think we can sit right around 15, and that'll be fine for this use. And then what we'll do, come on, reset here. There we go. And then what we'll do is see if adjusting any of this vignette is actually going to look good. I don't think it's really what I want. I do like the idea of being able to see a little bit more of that light here than what we were getting previously. So before and after, I got really dark here on the graduated filters that I put in. So what we'll do is go back in and adjust these slightly. I went quite crazy on that. And this is what I like to do. I really do this all the time. I start at 140% and then I dial it back just a little bit before I finalize the rest of my piece. And so at the end of the day, when it's all said and done, this is the process that I will use when I'm doing really any type of basic compositing work. This is stuff that's more fun in nature. This is not something that's very specific to cosplay. It's not specific to just product photographers. All of this stuff here that we're discussing right now really goes to anybody that's wanting to get into the CGI side of artwork and understanding how to work with it, post-production. That entire process is really a big deal. So I'm looking forward to you guys joining the class. I'm looking forward to those of you who are buying and going through the tutorial. We've got a lot of stuff to cover, and I'm extremely excited for that.